Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good evening. Welcome to all of you. Today we are very fortunate because we have two scholars with us tonight. Professor Asma Afsaruddin from Indiana University. She is a professor of Islamic Studies, Political Science, and Gender Studies in 3 departments. How great that is. And then we have Professor Jeffrey Kenny from DePaul University. He is also a professor of Political Science and Islamic Politics. Religious Studies. And you are also teaching Islamic Politics, I gather, from the website of the university. And Islam, women in Islam, isn't it? Yeah. Right. So, so with the presence of two distinguished scholars for tonight, we hope that we will have a rich discussion about the early history of Muslims, because we are discussing a book that has been translated by IRF and will be launched tomorrow, The First Muslims History and Memory, translated into Bahasa Melayu as Golongan Muslim Pertama, Sejarah dan Memori. So, without further ado, I would like to invite the author of the book that we are discussing, Professor Asma Afsaruddin, to begin discussing the book. Please welcome.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I just want to begin by thanking the organizers of these events, and of course I must recognize Dr. Ahmed Farouk Musa and you. Hasma, I'm very sorry. It's my age, I guess. I start forgetting names. And thank you for taking the initiative in translating my work. And I'll, obviously have a little bit more to say about that tomorrow. So I do have some notes prepared. Dr. Farouk, how long did you want me to?
Have it for 40 minutes.
Okay. So just give me sort of a thumbs up when
okay.
like 5 minutes before. Okay. So I have some notes prepared because I wanted to talk a little bit about the points that I think are important and more relevant than ever in our contemporary context that I've talked about in the book, The First Muslims, and give you a little idea of why I came to write the book. So One World Publications, which published the book, based in Oxford, England, approached me and asked me if I would like to write a book that presented the early history of Islam, but in a very accessible manner for a general audience. They were aware of my first book published by Brill called Excellence and Precedence, Issues in Legitimate Leadership, which dealt with the issue of the caliphate or the imamate in the early period of Islam. But that's a very dense book. It's a very close textual study of original sources, and of course it was not appropriate for a broader audience. And so they wanted to know if I would be interested in distilling some of the ideas that had emerged in the book and write a book like The First Muslims. And I agreed, thinking, it's a piece of cake. Once you've written a dense book like the one I had, writing a more general book would be easier. Actually, I found that far more challenging. It's harder, I think, sometimes to break down complex ideas in a way that would be accessible to a non-specialist audience. But having done it, I'm actually very grateful, because I gather, again, just from the interest that's been expressed here in Malaysia, that these ideas are very important to Muslims in general. And they would like to use these ideas as a springboard for further discussion among themselves. So I'm delighted, of course, that there is now a Malay translation available, because I've always felt that we shouldn't be talking to just fellow specialists and not just talking in an echo chamber, right, with other people who are familiar with the issues, but again, with a much broader audience who would be able to contribute, I think, original ideas as well themselves. So the book basically discusses the impact of the lives of many prominent men and women from roughly the first 3 centuries of Islam. And so, of course, we start with the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, his companions, the first generation Muslims, and the subsequent 2 generations of Muslims, the at-tabi'un, the successors, and at-tabi'u at-tabi'in, the successors to the successors. So we are roughly covering a period from 570, roughly the period of the start of the revelations, I should say the start of the life of the Prophet, until 855 CE, so the middle of the 9th century or the 3rd century of the Hijri era. And as all of you know, these three generations of Muslims are collectively called, in Arabic, as-salāf, as-sālih, the pious forebears. And why are they important? Because their religious practices and personal lives are deemed to be paradigmatic. They represent moral paradigms for subsequent generations of Muslims, and therefore they're considered to be worthy of imitation by later Muslims. So in the last couple of chapters of the book, I particularly explore how the Salaf have been understood by later generations of Muslims as iconic figures to legitimize many religious and political projects through time. So I wanted to make the past speak to the present. In other words, it wasn't enough for me to write simply the history of the first 3 centuries of Islam. I had to extrapolate lessons from that past and see how those lessons have been interpreted in many different ways by modern Muslims. And to illustrate the spectrum of views that exist among Muslims, and to simplify matters, I focused on 2 core groups. On one end of the spectrum are the modernists. They're also called liberal Muslims. Some people call them the pluralists. And at the other end of the spectrum is a group that I call the hardline Islamists. And the reason I call them hardline Islamists is because I wanted to distinguish them from more so-called moderate Islamists. By the way, I don't particularly like these labels, but I use them as a shorthand for, again, simplifying a very complex phenomenon, and because these terms have become very widely circulated and does have a certain resonance among us. But the idea was to show how these 2 groups evoke the past, but in dramatically different ways. And this becomes quite evident when we focus on the debates with one another on 3 particular hot button issues. I'm just going to focus on 3 issues, which I also dwell on in great detail in the book. The first is democratic governance, or issues of governance in general, jihad, the meanings of jihad, and gender roles. I'm assuming most of you have read the book or parts of it or are familiar with it. Okay, because I'm looking forward to my discussion with you at the end, and especially your take on some of my conclusions that I present towards the end of the book. So one of the first subjects one needs to broach in a book of this type is the question of what specific lessons can be learned from the life of the Prophet Muhammad that are particularly relevant today. So of course, if we go back to the life of the Prophet, we talk about the Sunnah, right? His customs and practices that are to be deemed normative for Muslims. So if you go back to the life of the Prophet himself, his life, as is popularly known among Muslims, is not necessarily based upon a canonical version of his biography. We are aware of the Sirah literature, right? Ibn Hisham's As-Sirah Nabawiyah, of course, has been translated into English and other languages. But if we stayed with those versions of his biography, then we realize that, of course, there's a lot of embellishment that's creeping into the narrative, and the Prophet actually appears much larger than life, right? And the reason for that is human memory can be very selective and creative at the same time. The multiple and particularly popular images of the Prophet that have taken hold of the imagination of Muslims in diverse societies speaks to the continuing relevance of his message in today's world and of the example he set for humankind. So in the book, I wanted to show him not as a superhuman, which he never claimed to be, by the way, but as a very human, even vulnerable man who was not only an inspired prophet, but also a husband, father, a warrior, and statesman. His compassion for the poor and the marginalized, particularly slaves, women, and the young, and to bring about social and political justice, speaks to contemporary Muslims who feel marginalized today on the global stage, and who thereby seek to empower themselves through reconnecting with the Prophet and his message. And I see this very strongly in some of the students I get in my class, some of the Muslim students I get, who really want to draw real life lessons from the life of the Prophet. It's not just a matter of historical interest, right, that it might be for, say, a strictly an academic. But for practicing Muslims, and for young people in particular, they really want to hear that message coming through. And so I wanted to show that it was through his propagation of such enduring ideas and principles that are understood by Muslims to be of divine origin. So it's not arbitrary, it's not just a human construction, but it's divine in origin and implemented by the Prophet in his life. And that through this propagation of enduring principles, it changed the course of world history forever, and therefore has the potential of transforming global society today. And this is what I see the main focus of the interest of a number of young people today, that they want to extrapolate those principles from the life of the Prophet because they believe they have the potential of transforming their societies in the contemporary world. So one of the most important topics I deal with is the question of political authority. You hear of political Islam all the time. In fact, there are people in the US who believe that Islam is merely a political ideology. It's not a religion, it's not a source of spiritual values, merely a political ideology. This is how politicized the image of Islam has become, particularly in the West, but also in Muslim majority societies, where political Islam, of course, has become a force to reckon with. So I thought it was very important for us to go back in time and dwell on the issue of how was political authority actually conceptualized in pre-modern Islam? And therefore, is there a continuity with those conceptualizations and the way political Islam is configured in the modern period? So again, if you look through the book already, you will know that I do engage in a very comprehensive canvassing of various sources. For example, focusing on a critical Quranic phrase in Arabic, ulul amr, meaning those having authority. That's usually how it's translated. And this is a phrase taken from Quran 4:59, which states in English translation, "O those who believe, obey God and the Messenger and those in possession of authority among you." And in Arabic, "Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu, ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul wa ulil amr minkum." The Arabic is very important. So when I did a diachronic survey of the literature that deals with this phrase, it clearly revealed that this term was understood, ulil amr, in the broadest sense, particularly in the early period. And one of the earliest meanings attached to this phrase was that it referred to people of learning and discernment. In Arabic, ahlul ilm wal fiqh, in the broadest sense. Remember, this is not fiqh as we understand it in the post-legal period, right, after the 4th, 10th century, but fiqh in the broadest sense of discernment, right, discernment, understanding. And therefore had no overt political meaning before roughly the 3rd or 9th century. Moreover, the Quran refers to ulil amr minkum. The Arabic is very important, which should translate as those having authority among you, right? The preposition min means among you. And so the preposition min is critical because it implies an egalitarian diffusion of authority among the people rather than a top-down imposition of authority, whoever that authority might be. So one of the purposes of engaging in an extended conversation about the phrase ulil amr was to show that one may derive many meanings from specific phrases and concepts present in the Quran, rather than assuming that there is a monolithic meaning of such concepts. The Quran, because of its universality and its emotive language, can speak to humans in different ways and in different times. And when we read the exceptionally rich commentary literature, the tafsir literature that exists on the Quran, we become aware of the diversity of interpretations that have traditionally existed within the Islamic tradition. The Quran opens itself up to us when we, of course, read it in the original and ponder its multi-layered meanings, mediated by our contemporary sensibilities and concerns. It therefore becomes highly problematic when any group of people or individual insists that there is only one correct interpretation of many key verses in the Quran, particularly those that have to do with universal values such as tolerance and compassion, justice and egalitarianism. And there is considerable agreement among Muslims concerning verses that deal with matters of worship, but beyond that, there is ample room for multiple and often equally valid interpretations. This is, of course, the famous division between ibadat and mu'amalat, right? That is known to all of you, I'm sure. Ibadat, referring to worship. Mu'amalat is a reference to worldly dealings, worldly interactions and transactions. The first, of course, is known and fixed, primarily through revelation, but in the second realm, there is considerably more leeway in the way we choose to implement certain foundational Islamic principles in the course of our lives and in interactions with one another in any given social and historical context. So we must, of course, critically engage the interpretive literature of the classical exegetes and learn to recognize the time-bound nature of their understanding, which may or may not be relevant to our own times and circumstances, and which we are therefore at liberty to accept or reject based on reasoned understanding. Unfortunately, a monolithic understanding of the Quran is frequently promoted by Orientalist scholars, whom I critique in the book, particularly Bernard Lewis, and in his book, The Political Language of Islam. Lewis misreads and mistranslates this important phrase, ulil amr minkum, as those having authority over you. For many of you who've struggled through Arabic, you know that prepositions can make a world of difference, right? So he translates it as those having authority over you, and that, of course, leads to a dramatically different conclusion. And this leads Lewis to make statements like the phrase, those having authority over you, implies that the Quran advocates that Muslims unquestioningly obey their political rulers. This is, of course, the result of careless scholarship, and this, of course, leads to a bad and actually even dangerous conclusion. So Lewis conveys the impression that political authoritarianism is built into the very structure of Islam and of Islamic political thought. This is an essentialist and biased view that has been propagated by other Orientalist scholars, particularly from his generation. I think H.A.R. Gibb also wrote along very similar lines, and we know that this view actually has enjoyed a bit of a resurgence in recent times. And in fact, this view was resurrected particularly by the neoconservatives under George W. Bush's presidency, and which led to disastrous political consequences, as you know, in the Middle East. So I am among those Muslims who believe that the case for democracy and democratization can be made from within the Islamic tradition itself. And these are not to be dismissed as alien ideas. Now, why do I say this? Although the Quran does not indicate any kind of a specific political system, the Quran is not a political manifesto, despite what some Islamists, I think, have claimed. It does, however, advocate certain social and public values that are meant to govern the collective lives of Muslims. Fundamental Islamic values of justice, egalitarianism, charity, and mercy belong in the public sphere. And Muslims have an important role to play in whatever society they live in to foster these principles that are universally shared with other religious and secular traditions. And there will always be debate in the public sphere about how best to achieve the full expression of such values, as there must be. But that is a healthy manifestation of a dynamic and confident society. And Islam's own history is full of such robust debates through the centuries, especially in its glory years when there was a flowering of learning and scholarly achievements. The so-called fundamentalist resurgence that we see in a number of Muslim-majority societies, which is negative, defensive, sometimes violent, and often without a reasoned intellectual base, has nothing to do with the kind of public activism that I'm talking about. I'm talking about Muslims taking part peacefully and legitimately in the political processes of their own societies, whether they are the majority or the minority. They also have the right to demand such political rights when they are denied them, and to work peacefully and assertively to obtain such rights. And we saw that happen during the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt. We only remember the cases of failure. However, we forget to mention that Tunisia actually remains a democratic country, and they've ratified a constitution and so forth. So it's still a work in progress. By the way, it's a work in progress everywhere in the world, right? There's no such thing as a perfect democracy. But the whole idea is that this is something you strive for. In the context of an Islamic political culture specifically, there are three foundational Islamic concepts that I would now like to emphasize. And these are Shura. I think everyone's heard of the word Shura. You can't engage political thought within Islam without bringing the concept of Shura. There's Bay'ah, and then there's Ijma'. So these concepts correspond to what I like to call in English the three C's, the letter C. Consultation, Shura, consent, the Bay'ah, and the consensus, Ijma'. All of which also implies accountability of those who govern to those who are being governed. And these concepts are the essential building blocks for a democratic political culture within Islamic societies. There is no single paradigm for democracy, of course, or for that matter, any political system that is mandated by Islam, but one can make the argument that a democratic political system today best embodies these three C's and is therefore in agreement with broad Islamic principles. Certainly the case has been made and continues to be made by a number of Muslim thinkers and reformists today. In the book, I discuss how the antecedent for the modern Islamist concept of al-Hakimiyyah, but not the term itself, may be found in the doctrine of the 7th century extremist group, the Kharijiyya. And of course, we have an expert on the Kharijiyya sitting right here. The Kharijiyya went on to fight Ali ibn Abi Talib for having submitted to human arbitration in the dispute between himself and Muawiyah. You know, he later became the first Umayyad ruler. The Kharijiyya stridently maintained that judgment or arbitration, al-hukm in Arabic, belongs only to God, and they refused to accept the validity of human intercession in this conflict between Ali and Muawiyah. And they were consequently ostracized on account of their extremism and proneness to violence. Paradoxically then, and to this day I don't understand why the Kharijiyya behaved the way they did, paradoxically, in spite of their vaunted adherence to the custom of the pious Salaf, and I'm talking about modern Islamists today, the Islamists are on record as not adopting the precedent set by Ali. Of course, Ali is a celebrated companion of the Prophet, cousin of the Prophet, and so forth, who resorted to human reasoning and arbitration to try and resolve the conflict at a politically critical moment. Instead, whose example are they following? They're following the example of his rank enemies, who did not do so, who did not behave the way Ali did not accept the validity of human arbitration, and who then were subsequently labeled as deviant by the rest of the community. The concept of the caliph ruling, for all practical purposes, as God's deputy on earth, and the Arabic term that corresponds to that would be Khalifatullah, is alien to Islamic political thought. Recent careful scholarship has shown that such notions seeped into the Islamic milieu through the infiltration of ancient Persian and Hellenistic ideas of divine or sacred kingship by the 9th century. What I'm saying is that this idea is not indigenous to the Islamic tradition. So the early egalitarian Islamic community largely recognized differences among the faithful on the basis of personal piety, taqwa, and also on moral excellence and precedence. And in Arabic, the two terms are as-sabiqa, for the moral precedence, and al-fadila, virtue or moral excellence. And that was the topic actually of my first book. And I found these two concepts repeated continuously through the early literature, insisting that these two traits be recognized in the leaders of the community. And such a moral attitude therefore found broad recognition in the socio-political organization of the early Islamic community. Leadership positions mostly, but not always, tended to devolve upon those who had already distinguished themselves for their exceptional piety and meritorious service to the Islamic community. And so, we can talk about many examples. One of the most famous examples is Salman al-Farisi. It's a non-Arab Persian convert to Islam without a distinctive lineage, and he was appointed to the governorship of Persia by Omar ibn Khattab, the second caliph, again because of his distinctive qualities. In the Sunni conception of the caliphate, the caliph is primus inter pares, right? The first among equals. But certainly in theory, he could be deposed for wrongdoing and could be chided, scolded, admonished for straying from good governing practices or for failing to confer with those he governed. And one of the examples I cite in the book is actually it's one of my favorite examples of an elderly woman chewing out Omar in the mosque at Medina because he wanted to impose a ceiling on the mahar, right, on the gift that's to be presented to the bride. And she remonstrates by saying the Prophet had granted women those rights, and who was he to take that away? And Omar, to his credit, admitted, right, that he was wrong. And he said, but a woman is right and Omar is wrong, right? So here we can see where there was a lot of give and take between the larger Muslim community and the caliph could be chided and scolded for wrongdoing or deviating from the sunnah of the Prophet, and people felt empowered to do that. And Muslim jurists also recognized the right of the people to rebel against unjust rulers as a matter of conscience, and set up specific criteria to distinguish justified political rebellion from treason and brigandage, for example. And this is a very important point to remember, because sometimes, again, you hear erroneously from certain quarters, certainly from Oriental scholars, but I think there's also a mistaken assumption among a number of Muslims themselves that you cannot rebel against a legitimately instituted authority, but the jurists recognize the right of people, if they had a genuine grievance, even against legitimate political authority, to do so, and to grant them the benefit of the doubt when they did. I was going to read Abu Bakr's inaugural address, but maybe in the interest of time, I'll skip that. It's a fairly long one, and it's in the book. But to me, it's a model of humility, even as the caliph. He certainly did not see himself as above the law. And there's a certain prominent democracy in the world today where a certain ruler, who shall remain unnamed, has begun to consider himself above the law of the land. And we have good reason to become worried when things reach that stage, because we are talking about political authoritarianism, and we're talking also about the possible onset of fascism, right? Where the rulers have no accountability to the people, and the people have no way of registering their opposition if they need to do so. But the important thing to point out about that speech is that Abu Bakr argues his case before the public in order to establish his credentials for the office based on the Quranic principles of as-sabiqa and fadila. And in the early accounts that describe Abu Bakr's election as caliph, there is no notion that unreflective obedience would be due to him from the people he governed. In fact, he states very clearly that if he should do something wrong, the people should, first of all, chide him, admonish him, but also that they had the right to depose him. So in the contemporary period, there is a variety of perspectives and discourses on what constitutes good governance and what institutions are required to implement it in Muslim-majority societies. On one point, however, it agrees that a majoritarian consensus is crystallizing in the contemporary period. And there have been large-scale surveys and polls conducted in Muslim-majority societies, such as the one conducted by the Pew Research Center's Global Attitudes Project in 2012. And this survey showed that the principle of Shura, consultation, endorsed in the Quran, as you know, as the basis for collective decision-making and administration of public affairs is generally understood in these societies, and this range from a broad spectrum of scholars, from hardline Islamists to liberal Muslims and everyone in between, that there is a wide consensus that Shura provides a conceptual basis for consultative governance and collective decision-making. Now, terminology can be a problem. If you call Shura democracy, you're going to get some people's backs up. And hardline Islamists reject democracy, I think, primarily on that basis. They will accept Shura, but democracy, that's a hard sell, because that's alien, right? That's tainted by non-Islamic ideologies and so forth. But liberal Muslim, and we've been talking about sort of the other end of the spectrum as liberal Muslims. I like to use other names also, labels for them. Modernists is one that I use actually in some ways more frequently, because I think liberal, the understanding of that I think sometimes can be fuzzy. But liberal Muslims usually will point to the convergence between the ideas of Shura and democracy. But however this critical concept may be interpreted, history does record the continuing endurance of the validity of this principle among Muslims. And I remember looking at the tafsir work of Al-Qurtubi, and I forget now in which verse he was talking about the importance of Shura, but he, and we're talking about what, the 13th century, right? For Al-Qurtubi, the Andalusian Mufassir, he's basically saying if leaders are elected without recourse to Shura and they misbehave, the people should remove them from their offices, that they should basically be uninstalled from the offices that they were appointed to. So we do see, continuously through the generations, this reverence for the idea of Shura, even though, as we know, dynastic rule set in very, very soon in the early history of Islam. Another point in which there is considerable disagreement between modernist or liberal Muslims and hardline Islamists is on their understanding of the Sharia. Hardline Islamists understand the Sharia to be a practically immutable, unchangeable, frozen religious law. And the two principal sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, are assumed by them to admit often of a single and uniform and often literal meaning. While there still may be room for interpretation in limited cases, recent interpretive activity, the famous ijtihad, is the province of only a few, and preferably those who subscribe to their own worldview and their own take on things and share their ideological orientation. So the room, the interpretive room left for ijtihad is actually very, very circumscribed, very limited as far as they're concerned. Hardliners tend to reject the possibility of multiple, equally valid interpretations of the religious law as expressed in the four Sunni schools of jurisprudence, since in their view, proper interpretation of the law by those who are qualified to do so will yield a single uniform understanding of it. And they claim to find their historical evidence in the precedents set by the first generation of Muslims, who are deemed to have flawlessly emulated the example of the Prophet Muhammad and apparently never disagreed among themselves on key issues. And they often suppress the history of disagreement, even among the companions, on a number of different issues, and that there were multiple interpretations of a number of concepts. Nor, as far as they're concerned, as far as the hardline Islamists are concerned, there is very little room also for the historical contextualization of legal rulings as they developed over time, nor for the invocation of maslaha, the public good, as grounds for legal reasoning, as actually occurred in the praxis of Muslim communities through time. The slogan, Islam is the solution, I think you must have a version of that in Malay. What is it? I'm just kind of curious.
Islam adalah penyelesaian.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
The Malay translation.
Okay, all right.
We prefer the Arabic one.
Al-Islam wal hal.
So you do use that. Al-Islam huwa al-hal? Okay. Well, the slogan is meant to convey to the world that Islam understood as a frozen corpus of religious and political commandments, has left nothing unaddressed. Not surprisingly then, hardline Islamists, who we may also describe as absolutists, right? They have an absolute position on many issues. Like the famous Egyptian revolutionary Sayyid Qutb, have more frequently referred to Islam as a system, nizam. If you read some of his works, he's constantly referring to Islam as a system, right, rather than as a faith. Now, in contrast to such absolutist positions, modernists or liberals typically argue against the assumed all-pervasive nature of the Sharia and against the notion that the Sharia comes with ready-made answers to every imaginable circumstance. Modernists tend to affirm that the reach of the religious law extends to many aspects of human existence while not directly addressing others. So again, we have that division between ibadat and mu'amalat, right? Between worship and worldly transactions. And they will typically argue that outside of worship, the Sharia actually offers more guidelines, broad guidelines, rather than detailed commands for proper conduct in various spheres of social and other forms of interaction. The religious law certainly does not and cannot have a specific injunction in advance for every possible human situation or contingency. The Quran, the principal source of the religious law, is not, after all, a law book. And I think this is Fazlur Rahman's quotation. The Quran is not a law book, but is a repository, a storehouse of broad moral principles from which a legal system may be derived. And this legal system, derived from the Quran as well as from the Sunnah, is the result of human reasoning and effort, and thus contextually determined and historically contingent. I think this is one of the most important distinctions between the absolutists, the hardliners, and the modernist or liberal Muslims, on the other hand. Modernists further tend to emphasize the application of the intent and overall objectives, the maqasid of Sharia, more than the literal injunctions of the Sharia, especially when the literal understanding of a specific rule in a particular circumstance would result in unusual hardship and or violation of an inviolable broader moral imperative. And so many of them will argue that since the Sharia must uphold certain ethical values, such as justice and mercy at all times, specific legal injunctions may never violate these fundamental principles in any given historical and social circumstance. Also, liberals and more modernist Muslims will typically place more emphasis on the identification of the rationale, the illah, right? The illah of any given hukm or ahkam. So place more emphasis on the underlying rationale of specific legal rulings rather than on their literal textual meaning. The idea is that you try to get behind the particular ruling, right? And if it's related to fiqh, when we're talking about juridical interpretations, what did the jurists have in mind when they crafted a certain rule and when they implemented it in a certain way? Jihad is another topic. How am I doing on time?
You have like 10 more minutes.
Okay. All right. Then I will very quickly speed through jihad, because this is one point on which they're sharply divided, right? I'm not asserting here that all hardline Islamists are militant or that they invariably resort to violence. That's very far from the truth, right? But there are militants among them who do understand jihad in a very particular way, and they usually understand jihad as the waging of unrelenting military activity against non-Muslims deemed hostile to Islam, but also against those perceived as lapsed Muslims who also have to be politically defeated. So the true Muslims, namely themselves, who die waging militant activity against their enemies are martyrs. Once again, these militant Islamists attempt to justify their positions and rhetoric but asserting that they reflect 1st or 7th century views on jihad and martyrdom. And they will very predictably refer to very select verses from the Quran. One of them, of course, is Quran 9:5, which they like to call the ayat as-sayf, the sword verse. There's also the jizya verse, Quran 9:29. But they don't offer any contextualization of these verses. They don't refer to the tafsir literature diachronically. And they've also developed a cult of martyrdom. Of course, we've seen that carry to its most horrible excess in the actions, the recent actions of Daesh and before them Al-Qaeda. But there is this cult of martyrdom that has also taken hold of them. And for them, there is no higher status. Of course, part of their militant conception of jihad is based on their doctrine of takfir, right? Which is, again, I'm sure known to all of you. The declaration of Muslims whom they consider as lukewarm or lapsed to be unbelievers. And I think you've heard of the tract that was penned by Abdussalam Faraj. I think you discuss him in your book, do you not? And he wrote the Al-Farida Al-Ghaiba, the lapsed or neglected duty, referring again to the duty of militant jihad. But again, here jihad is now being used against Muslims, right? This is something, however, you do not find in pre-modern juridical texts where jihad as military activity is directed against the external aggressor, not to be used to quell dissension or any kind of doctrinal difference among Muslims themselves. And finally, well, then in contrast, I guess I need to set up the contrast. So in contrast to them, though, typically modernists or Muslim reformists point to the diversity of opinions throughout the classic and post-classical period about the meanings of jihad, and the point to also literature that talks about the importance of coexisting with non-Muslims and peacefully. So they will typically look at, first of all, the seerah of the Prophet, but also accounts of the lives of particularly the Khulafa Rashidun, right? They rightly guided caliphate to point to examples of coexistence and Irenic or liberal interpretations of the law that did not discriminate against non-Muslims. So for example, one of the favorite examples of modernists is the treatment of the Christian Abyssinians. Of course, Abyssinia is famous for what? The very first hijrah that we often tend to forget about, right? When a band of Muslims emigrated to Abyssinia, sought refuge there from the Christian king, and he was happy to give it to them. But because the memory of these Abyssinians were so deeply engraved in the imagination of the Muslims that Abyssinians did not have to pay the jizya, either during the time of the Prophet or after him, because they were considered to be people of goodwill. They were not hostile people, right? And jizya typically was to be collected from hostile people of the book, Ahlul Kitab, who had actually risen up in militant activity against Muslims. In fact, I looked at the so-called jizya verse, the 929, and the earliest mufassir, either Mujahid ibn Jabr or Muqatil ibn Sulaymah, identifies specifically the Byzantines as the referent in this verse, because the Byzantines, this was the reference to the Battle of Mu'ta, right, where the Byzantines had, or were rumored to have, amassed a large army, and they were preparing to fight the Muslims, right? So he restricts it only to the Byzantines and does not understand it to be a reference to all the Ahlul Kitab. That interpretation changed considerably in the later period. But we do have other historical instances where the jizya was not taken from the Ahlul Kitab. Other than the Abyssinians, the Nubians of North Africa, although they were non-Muslims, and also because they were also not one of the Ahlul Kitab, did not have to pay any kind of taxes to Muslims. Instead, they entered into a trade agreement. And so under the terms of that trade agreement, they just mutually traded goods, but they were not paying any kind of a jizya or tribute to Muslims. So these are the kind of historical examples that modernist Muslims will another narrative, a different narrative about the possibility of coexistence based on mutual goodwill and based on mutual agreements with in trade, whether that be trade agreements or a pact of nonviolence and so forth. So I'm going to cut this section short, although, again, there are more details in the book. And again, I'd be happy to bring some of these issues up in the discussion section. And then finally, with regard to gender. Here also we find sharp disagreements between hardliners and the modernists. And I will be actually engaging this topic in far greater detail on Monday. But quick points. One of the points that modernists typically like to make is that they point to the early Islamic community, and particularly under the Prophet, and describe it as having been exceptionally inclusive of women. Now, we usually talk about political rights as, particularly as granted to women, as having been born in the modern period, that this could not possibly have had an analog in the pre-modern period, in the medieval period. But a lot of people will point to the fact that women, when they joined the Medinan community, had to actually give their bay'ah to the Prophet himself. So individually, in other words, it could not be offered on behalf of the woman by a male guardian, right? So she was individually, on her own authority, proclaiming her allegiance to the Prophet and her decision to enter the Muslim community. And so, looking back, modernists tend to understand this as politically enfranchising women so that they had a voice in the Muslim community and they were accorded the right to politically participate in the community, right? So this is, again, a modernist and a very liberal interpretation of the bay'ah as it related to women, in fact. And, you point to a number of the women companions who are very active in the public sphere. Of course, Aisha is the perennial favorite. She led a battle against Ali, and she had a number of male followers, and it seems like it was not, her role as a political figure was not looked at askance. History judged her less charitably later on because, of course, she had gone up against Ali, who was then recognized as one of the historically rightly guided caliphs, but that's a different matter. In terms of gender, though, no one questioned her right to lead a battle, right? And we know that the whole battle is actually called the Battle of the Camel on account of her riding mount. And if you look at early Muslim biographers like Ibn Sa'd, now I love his tabaqat work. I'm assuming some of you are familiar with that. The reason I love that work is that in contrast to later biographical works, and in the book I contrast the accounts given by Ibn Hajar, who's from the Mamluk period in the 14th century. He also had a biographical section on the women companions. And I compare his accounts with that given by Ibn Sa'd in his tabaqat. And there are some really glaring discrepancies. Ibn Hajar will often, sometimes, minimize the role of a female companion, say in a battle or in the public sphere. Whereas Ibn Sa'd will give glorious details about women's participation in the public sphere. So it's very important for us to go back to some of the earliest sources to get a better understanding of what society would have been like at that time, and particularly in relation to gender. I give the example of how Omar appointed a woman, Shifa bint Abdullah, as the muhtasiba of Medina. Today we would consider that to be the equivalent of a mayor's position. I think you must have read in the papers that Tunisia just appointed the first mayor of Tunis, and I'm like, what is the uproar all about? Or, this is not unusual. If you look at the early history of Islam, actually there were very many prominent women in many different roles, but particularly in education. Women scholars trained other male scholars. Ibn Hajar himself, by the way, had a number of women teachers. So it was really not that unusual. And I talk about how Omar entrusted the first mushaf, incomplete mushaf of the Quran, to his daughter, right, to Hafsa. He could have given it to one of his sons. He didn't, because Hafsa actually was more learned, and I think he considered her to be more mature and more reliable than either one of his sons. Again, there are many examples of that sort. I don't think I have to give all these examples to you, but in conclusion, I wanted to pick out one sentence from the book. And so I think in the last few pages, I say, given the fact that Islam's formative period remains contested among many to this day, reclamation of this past in a responsible and historically defensible way must remain part and parcel of every contemporary reformist project that wishes to gain broad legitimacy and acceptance. We really do have to understand the past in order to understand the present. So I think I'm going to leave it at that and take your questions, comments, whatever, however we wish to proceed.